Hey folks, I'm Matt. Welcome to the lab. This is part 2 of our series where we're developing an unmanned aerial system. Now last time, in part 1, we established our use case, which is to improve on rural EMS response times to opioid overdoses with Narcan delivery drones. It has a pretty cool mission and it has me very excited for this project. This time in part 2, we have 3 objectives. We got to name our aircraft program, we need to think through the concept of operations or the CONOPS for how these missions will be performed, and we need to plan out our approach to the project. So let's get to it. Now, like any respectable aircraft program, ours needs a number and a name. And all the projects I've been doing under Height Aquarius Labs get a 900 series designation, so this one will be HAL 904. For the name, I'm going with Airmed, and I like it because it's got a couple layers of meaning. The first, it's very literal, it's descriptive. We're going to be delivering life-saving medication by air. Second layer is a little bit more symbolic. So in Irish mythology, Airmed or Airmed is the goddess of healing, and I think that ties in kind of beautifully with our program. Plus it just rolls off the tongue, Airmed. Since we're trying to improve on rural EMS response, we should probably start out by looking at how that currently works and some of the challenges it faces. Let's say someone discovers their friend unresponsive. They think quick and call 911. When the ambulance is dispatched, it might have to take a long, indirect route, and that's just because of the large area it has to cover out in the country. On its way, it might have to cross mountains or other challenging terrain, and it might have to slow down on unimproved dirt roads. It could even get stopped in its tracks by long freight trains or other obstructions. Airmed won't be susceptible to any of these challenges. It'll fly a direct route straight to the emergency, and it'll avoid challenging terrain and obstructions by flying right over them. That's not to say it won't have its own unique challenges, but this highlights how we'll achieve the benefits we're looking for. So let's dig a little deeper and flesh out a few possible CONOPS for Airmed. In scenario A, a 911 call comes in and Airmed is dispatched. It flies direct to the scene of the emergency, loiters overhead to assess the area, and finds somewhere to safely land. Someone on scene then retrieves and administers the Narcan, potentially saving a life. Airmed takes off and returns to base, and an ambulance arrives on scene later to follow up with more complete medical intervention. Scenario B is very similar to Scenario A. The only difference is that once it lands at the scene of the emergency, it stays there. So instead of flying back, the EMS personnel can retrieve Airmed and drive it back. This gives Scenario B a potential advantage over Scenario A in that it would increase the mission radius since it's flying a one-way trip. Scenario C starts out similar to A and B. 911 call comes in, Airmed is dispatched. It flies directly to the emergency and loiters overhead to assess the area. The difference is, instead of landing, Airmed would safely drop the Narcan payload and return to base. For any aircraft, landing can be the most dangerous, difficult part of its mission, and that's especially true when landing in unprepared locations. For Airmed, if we want to do that remote landing autonomously, it'll require a suite of high-end sensors and sophisticated, robust algorithms. That'll drive up the cost and complexity of the system. On the other hand, if we want a remote pilot to take over for that landing, they're going to need extensive training and certification to do it, and that could prove a barrier for deploying the system at scale. So in Scenario C, by eliminating that remote landing, we could dramatically simplify our requirements. So these are just a few possible CONOPS scenarios. In the future, we'll likely have to develop many more in far greater detail, and for each of those, perform analyses to see what's possible, and within that, what's optimal. But for now, these are enough to get us going. This project is complex enough that it's worth taking a moment early on here to sort of look ahead and plan out the overall approach. And admittedly, there's a lot that I don't know about what I'm getting into here. But for me, that's kind of the point. Figuring stuff out and learning are some of my favorite parts of working on projects, and that is no exception here. And not only is there a lot that I don't know, those things fall into many different learning curves. And I know if I try to tackle all of them at once, I'm just going to get bogged down and I won't make good progress. My solution to that is to try to split those learning curves into different phases of the project. The way I see it right now, those learning curves fall into two broad categories. So on the one hand is everything you need to make a really well-engineered aircraft. And on the other hand is kind of everything else, right? So autonomy, fabrication techniques, the electronics, even just the flight operations. And so in phase one of the project, I'm going to focus on that everything else. And to make that happen, I'm going to make a bare bones airplane. Something simple, it'll get us in the air with stable flight, and it can function as a platform that we can use to wring out all those other systems. And for now, to get us going, I'm going to forgo any kind of trade study on the configuration of our aircraft and just build a simple flying wing. It should be relatively easy to design and to build, and there's a lot of good resources available from the RC community. For phase two, we can leverage everything we learned from phase one, but double back and really engineer the aircraft to meet specific performance requirements. Phase three is a little too far out to say right now, so we'll leave that TBD for the meantime. The other thing I'm doing to get off the blocks quickly is starting with a subscale demonstrator. This is a very common practice in the aerospace industry that lets you get a lot of lessons learned quickly without the cost, complexity, and difficulty of a full-scale aircraft. It's just important to keep in mind the differences between your subscale demonstrator and the eventual full-scale aircraft. We've accomplished our part 2 objectives. Hang tight, because in part 3 we're going to lay down some requirements for phase 1 of the project. We're going to assess the feasibility of what we're trying to do, and then we can get into the sizing and conceptual design for our subscale demonstrator. Of course, got to do the YouTube thing at the end here. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and if you want to see more content, hit subscribe and find me on Instagram at HydeAquarius. Till next time, be safe.